Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Men, Women, and Chainsaws, Gender in the Modern Horror Film, by Carol J. Clover, narrated by Eva Wilhelm. Preface to the Princeton Classics edition. Consider two of this book's previous covers. The first shows a close-up, head-on photo of a monstrous assailant, partially masked, mouth hideously distorted, seeming to look directly into our eyes as he comes at us. The second cover also shows a face in close-up, also looking directly out at us, but this face is that of a woman, her eyes wide with something like alarm. The images are perfect opposites. In the first, we are positioned as the object of what looks to be a psychotic attacker. In the other, we are positioned as the subject, doing something to cause the look of apprehension in the woman's eyes. It's as though the covers are looking at each other. The scary cover from the original 1992 Princeton University Press edition is the one I proposed as a way of signaling the book's angle on what I call new regime horror, the flood of low-budget films starting in the mid-1970s that would have such an impact on the nature and direction of the genre thereafter. The other cover, which appeared sometime later and without input from me, is that of the edition published in the United Kingdom by BFI. As it turned out, the tension between those two cover positions anticipated a tension in the book's reception more generally in the years to follow. The public response turned, for the most part, on the slasher movie chapter, Chapter 1, Her Body, Himself, in particular on the figure that I called the final girl. The fate of that trope since then has largely determined, for better or worse, the intellectual and more broadly cultural trajectory of the book itself. I say for worse not because of the final girl's appropriations in rock and rap music, novels, plays, films, and the like, but because, in the course of that history, she has eclipsed other figures and issues in the book, and, more to the point, has in her wanderings become a rough sketch of her former self. Detached from her low-budget origins and messier meanings, she now circulates in these mostly cleaner and more upscale venues as a female avenger, triumphant feminist hero, and the like. This is not to discount some striking reworkings and cogent reviews, only to point out that in much of the wider discourse, the sketch version more or less hijacked not only the character of the final girl, but the chapter in which she figures, and indeed the book as a whole, which is not infrequently referred to as one about slasher movies and their feminist heroes. Not that this account of the final girl is entirely wrong. She's the character whose story we follow from beginning to end, and the one from whose vantage, even through whose eyes, we see the action. And it is she who, at the end of the film, brings the killer down, though more often by chance than intention. Needless to say, this sounds more like a male protagonist than a female one, and it was indeed a startling development, beginning in the mid-1970s, to have not just a few movies but dozens of them, with a girl at the center of the story. She's a boyish girl, even named something like Stevie or Will or Stretch, but a girl nonetheless. As a sketch, at least, the final girl does look something like a female hero, an effect, it has been argued, of the powerful discourses on gender during that era, above all the women's movement. But a sketch is only a sketch. Fill this one out with the dimensions of affect, identification, pacing, and audience, and the picture gets kinkier. Yes, the final girl brings down the killer in the final moments, but consider how she spent a good hour of the film up to then, being chased and almost caught, hiding, running, falling, rising in pain and fleeing again, seeing her friends mangled and killed by weapon-wielding killers, and so on. Tortured survivor might be a better term than hero. Or, given the element of last-minute luck, she happens in her flailing on a cup of hot coffee or some other such item which she throws into her assailant's eyes, accidental survivor. Or, as I call her, victim hero, with an emphasis on victim. It's a great moment when she stops the killer, but to imagine that her and our experience of the film reduces to that last-minute reversal is truly to miss the point. The point is fear and pain, hers and by proxy, ours. As the critic Philip Brophy said of horror more generally, the pleasure of the text is in fact getting the shit scared out of you, and loving it in an exchange mediated by adrenaline. It is with the final girl's suffering that the film leads us to identify, and not only narratively, but cinematically. To be sure, we see much of the action through the usual third-person camera. We also see the final girl from the perspective of her pursuers, although these shots are fewer and further between than one might expect, particularly if one's idea of a horror movie was formed during the era in which we were shown countless views of frightened women through the eyes of their tormentors via a more or less sadistic male gaze, views not unlike the one on the British cover. One of the most frequent and compelling images in the horror film repertoire, writes J.P. Talott of the traditional genre, is that of the wide, staring eyes of some victim, expressing stark terror or disbelief and attesting to an ultimate threat to the human proposition. What is impressive, though, and all but unprecedented, are the many shots, some of them excruciatingly long, that reverse that optic, giving us fuller, more intense and unambiguous access to the victim's point of view, in effect, putting us in the mind and body of the prey rather than the predator. The image on the original Princeton cover is a prey's eye view. The dynamic is even more brazen in rape-revenge movies like I Spit on Your Grave, Chapter 3, Getting Even. That film's main character, Jennifer, a city woman who has rented a summer house in the country in hopes of finishing a novel, gets raped and sodomized by a group of local young men. We are narratively and cinematically aligned with her as it happens. This means, among other things, that although we get some third-person views of her tortured body, as well as some views from the rapist's perspective, the governing vantage is Jennifer's, even as she is being violated. We are repeatedly made to see, for example, a screen more or less filled with the image of a man's face bearing down on us as we lie supine. The point was not lost on reviewers. Instead of getting close-ups of a terrified woman staring into a camera, a standard cinematic device equating viewer with attacker, wrote one, the film features similar shots of the rapist's threatening faces. The viewer is thus forced into the position of victim, not villain. Another wrote, the men are so grossly unattractive and the rapes so harrowing, long drawn out and starkly presented, that it is hard to imagine most male spectators identifying with the perpetrators, especially as the film's narrative structure and mise-en-scène force the spectator to view the action from Jennifer's point of view. It should be noted that the Jennifers of the rape-revenge films come closer than the final girls of slasher films to being heroes, taking, as they do, the long remainder of the movie to calculate and then execute revenge on their assailants. And who were these spectators? Mostly young men, typically teenagers. Seeing as I did Texas Chainsaw Massacre, my first slasher film, and my first new regime horror film of any kind, in a large theater with a live audience, remains the most startling movie-going experience I've had. Not because the spectators responded unusually, but because of the mismatch between who they were and what they were watching, and the implications of that incongruity. It would seem that males, or at least some males, were readier to sign on to female surrogates than the standard account would have it, and then higher forms of cinema had registered, which is to say that the male spectator was more willing than we might expect to feel himself on the receiving end of brutal and humiliating acts, one after another, including sexual penetration. The wildly phallic imagery of slasher films, chainsaws, knives, power drills, and the like, is a kind of fig leaf over their real work, aligning their viewers with the female character and giving them dose after dose of so-called feminine masochism of the most extreme sort. With a few significant exceptions, these films were also written and directed by men. No wonder the final girl is boyish. That quality makes her a congenial double for the adolescent male. As I put it in the book, she is feminine enough to act out in a gratifying way, a way unapproved for adult males, the terrors and masochistic pleasures of the underlying fantasy, but not so feminine as to disturb the structures of male competence and sexuality. Further, to applaud the final girl as a feminist development is, in light of her figurative meaning, a particularly grotesque expression of wishful thinking. She is simply an agreed-upon fiction, and the male viewer's use of her as a vehicle for his own sadomasochistic fantasies, an act of perhaps timeless dishonesty. At some 20 years' distance, I'd back off a bit from the severity of that last sentence, for although I continue to marvel at the way female screen figures have been so relentlessly deployed for her-body, himself sensations, the question in retrospect, given the real-life sex/gender transformations in the intervening decades, is whether the brazenness of the move in slasher films was an act of dishonesty or of admission, or of something in between. That admission was on New Regime Horror's agenda is clear from another of its subgenres, the possession film. These opening up stories, the subject of Chapter 2, tell of men who come, over the course of the film, to accept and even embrace a side of themselves that they had previously scorned, the irrational, sentimental, emotional, spiritual, vulnerable side, a side represented in extreme form by the demonically possessed women in their lives, and a side overtly figured in vaginal, uterine, and menstrual terms. The man who can open up to this world is a man who can save not only the woman from her demons, but himself from spiritual or literal suicide. These are didactic films, the feminine project of which is right up front. It is in the context of these other subgenres that the slasher's final girl wants seeing. Taken together, these films offer variant imaginings of what it is or might be like to be a woman, to menstruate and be pregnant, to be vulnerable to and endure male violence, to be sexually violated. What New Regime Horror showed us is that at least some male audiences were willing to make believe these sensations. Whether this is a good or a bad thing for women, given the inescapability of these and other parts of our identity, is far from clear. The political implications for feminism and for film theory, and the place of such films in the history of cinema more generally, are the subject of the book's final chapter, The Eye of Horror, EYE, also betokening I. So the final girl seems to have hijacked even this new preface to the Princeton Classics edition. That's perhaps as it should be, given that without her, there probably wouldn't be one. And maybe, after all her wanderings, she deserves the last word. Introduction. Carrie and the Boys. The hit horror movie of 1976, in fact one of the winners in a horror-happy decade, was Carrie. Directed by Brian De Palma and based on a novel by Stephen King, it tells the story, as King sums it up in Danse Macabre, of a girl named Carrie White, the browbeaten daughter of a religious fanatic. Because of her strange clothes and shy mannerisms, Carrie is the butt of every class joke, the social outsider in every situation. Actually, much of the torment Carrie comes in for has to do with menstruation. When she gets her first period in the locker room shower and doesn't know what it is, the other girls scream with laughter and shout, "Plug it up! Plug it up!" as they pelt her with tampons and sanitary pads. But the source of her pain soon becomes the source of her power. She also has a mild telekinetic ability, which intensifies after her first menstrual period, and she finally uses this power to bring down the house following a terrible social disaster at her high school prom. The disaster in question is a grim practical joke, whereby she is led to believe that she has been elected queen of the senior prom, only to have a bucket of pig's blood dumped down on her at the moment she is crowned, to which she responds with the force of her telekinetic will, causing the gym to go up in flames and her entire high school class with it. With its prom queens, menstrual periods, tampons, worries about clothes and makeup, Carrie would seem on the face of it the most feminine of stories. For author King, it is also a feminist one. If The Stepford Wives concerns itself with what men want from women, then Carrie is largely about how women find their own channels of power and what men fear about women and women's sexuality, which is only to say that, writing the book in 1973 and only out of college 3 years, I was fully aware of what women's liberation implied for me and others of my sex. The book is, in its more adult implications, an uneasy masculine shrinking from a future of female equality. For me, Carrie White is a sadly misused teenager, an example of the sort of person whose spirit is so often broken for good in that pit of man and woman-eaters that is your normal suburban high school. But she's also woman, feeling her powers for the first time and, like Samson, pulling down the temple on everyone in sight at the end of the book. But where exactly is the horror here? If women's liberation is the fear, is Carrie its representative monster? And if she is, who is the victim and who is the hero? The answer would seem to be that, like Samson, Carrie is all three in turn. Throughout most of the movie, she is the victim of monstrous schoolmates and a monstrous mother, but when, at the end, she turns the tables, she herself becomes a kind of monstrous hero insofar as she has risen against and defeated the forces of monstrosity, monster insofar as she has herself become excessive, demonic. She has become, in short, what I shall throughout this book call the female victim hero, the hero part always understood as implying some degree of monstrosity, whose status in both roles has indeed been enabled by women's liberation. Feminism, that is, has given a language to her victimization and a new force to the anger that subsidizes her own act of horrific revenge. But to whom does this tale appeal? King again. And one reason for the success of the story in both print and film, I think, lies in this. Carrie's revenge is something that any student who has ever had his gym shorts pulled down in phys ed or his glasses thumb-rubbed in study hall could approve of. Now, although the his in King's brief analysis of Carrie's popularity may in principle refer to the universal subject, the any student in question here looks a lot like an adolescent boy. Pulling gym shorts down and thumb-rubbing glasses are things boys do to each other, not by and large things that girls do to each other or that boys do to girls. They are oblique sexual gestures, the one threatening sodomy or damage to the genitals or both, and the other threatening damage to the eyes, a castration of sorts. Remember that Samson, too, whom King invokes as Carrie's analog, was bound, shorn, and blinded before he managed to bring the temple down. The boy so threatened and so humiliated, King seems to be saying, is a boy who recognizes himself in a girl who finds herself bleeding from her crotch in the gym shower, pelted with tampons, and sloshed with pig's blood at the senior prom. What this gym shorts and glasses remark of King's admits, glancingly but unmistakably, is a possibility that film theory, film criticism, cultural studies analysis, movie reviews, and popular political commentary seldom entertain. The possibility that male viewers are quite prepared to identify not just with screen females, but with screen females in the horror film world, screen females in fear and pain. That identification, the official denial of that identification, and the larger implications of both those things are what this book is about. What horror, what viewers, and what sort of identification exactly? The compass of this book is rather narrow. I concern myself chiefly with American cinematic horror, a category I define somewhat loosely, chiefly with films from the 1970s to the mid-1980s, with some reference back to progenitors, and only with those subgenres in which female figures and/or gender issues loom especially large: slasher films, occult or possession films, and rape-revenge films. I originally planned to concentrate on low or exploitation horror, terms I mean descriptively, not judgmentally, but that proved both impractical and finally intellectually unjustifiable. The traffic between low and high is such that it is unnatural to separate them, and I have accordingly mixed the levels. As the following chapters will suggest, it remains my conviction that innovation trickles upward as often as downward, and that the fiscal conditions of low-budget filmmaking are such that creativity and individual vision can prosper there in ways they may not in mainstream environments. As I shall propose, the independent, low-budget tradition has been central in the manufacture of the new tough girls that have loomed so large in horror since the mid-70s. Not only figures like Carrie, whose power somehow derives from their female insides, but the boyish, knife-wielding victim heroes of slasher films and the grim avengers of their own rapes in films like Ms. 45 and I Spit on Your Grave. To the question of who watches such films, there is no neat answer. Film audiences are in general less analyzed than television audiences, and because what statistical surveys there are tend to be sponsored by major studios, and a fair percentage of horror is, or has been, produced independently, horror audiences are especially understudied. Horror movies tend to be made less on the basis of audience statistics than on the basis of hunch, imitation, hence the proliferation of sequels and rip-offs, and in higher-budget cases, test audience results. To complicate matters further, many horror films have short theatrical runs or no theatrical release at all, but return their investment on video cassette rentals, the audience for which is largely hidden from research view. Still, what formal surveys and informal accounts there are bear out with remarkable consistency Stephen King's presumption that adolescent males hold pride of place. At theater screenings, in any case, the constituencies typically break down in order of size as follows: young men, frequently in groups but also solo; male-female couples of various ages, though mostly young; solo rogue males, older men of ominous appearance and/or reactions; and adolescent girls in groups. The proportions vary somewhat from subgenre to subgenre and from movie to movie. The more mainstream the film, the more normal the audience, but the preponderance of young males appears constant. Certainly boys are the unmistakable target audience of horror fanzines, nor do videocassette rentals seem to depart significantly from the profile. In the absence of statistics, I have polled some 60 employees of rental outlets, half in the San Francisco area, half elsewhere in the country, about the clientele for certain films: Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I Spit on Your Grave, Ms. 45, Witchboard, Videodrome, and The Evil Dead, and they confirm to a person the young male bias. 3 local outlets were generous enough to track for a period of about 4 weeks the rentals of 2 low-budget rape-revenge films, I Spit on Your Grave and Ms. 45. The reasons for my interest in those 2 films in particular will become clear in Chapter 3. Their results were consistent. Ms. 45 was rented about 4 times out of 5 by men, and its renters of both sexes were nearly all under the age of 25. I Spit on Your Grave, much the grislier of the 2, rented 9 times out of 10 to male viewers, mostly under the age of 25, but occasionally older. The odd blip reported by one employee of 2 women at least 30 turned out to be friends of mine renting it at my suggestion. The renter of a videocassette is not necessarily its only watcher, of course, and Berkeley audiences are not all audiences, but the numbers are suggestive, and they do square with the standard profile of theater audiences for horror. I want to stress, before I pass on to other matters, that the bias of my book is even more extreme than the bias of the overall horror audience. My interest in the male viewer's stake in horror spectatorship is such that I have consigned to virtual invisibility all other members of the audience, despite the fact that their loyalty and engagement can be just as ardent and their stake in the genre just as deserving of attention. One of the surprises of this project has been the number of what I once thought of as unlikely people, middle-aged, middle-class people of both sexes, who have come out to me about their secret appetite for so-called exploitation horror, and I have developed a great respect, through conversations not only with them but with teenage fans, for the variety and richness of people's relationship to such texts. A study of horror film audiences per se would take into account the full range of their composition, not to speak of the range of experiences the same movie may offer the rogue male, the adolescent boy, and the middle-aged woman. This book, however, is not about horror audiences per se any more than it is about horror per se. It is a book that explores the relationship of the majority viewer, the younger male, to the female victim heroes who have become such a conspicuous screen presence in certain sectors of horror. That pairing has much to tell us, I think, about spectatorship in general, not to speak of the politics of representation, the politics of displacement, and the politics of criticism and theory. Identification is the subject of a voluminous theoretical literature. Following Christian Metz, commentators tend to distinguish between primary identification, with the camera, wherever it may be and whatever it may be up to, and secondary identification, with the character of empathic choice. Both are fluid. Character identification on the psychoanalytic grounds that competing figures resonate with competing parts of the viewer's psyche, masochistic victim and sadistic monster, for example, and camera identification on the cinematographic grounds that the camera can entertain different positions with ease, not just character positions but omniscient ones, and with different degrees of personality, the handheld first-person or subjective camera thought by convention to be the most personal of all. Laura Mulvey has famously maintained that the cinematic gaze, constitutive of primary identification, is not gender-free, but is structured by male or masculine perceptions, a fact revealed when the camera's object is a woman. The cinematic apparatus, according to Mulvey, has two ways of looking at a woman, both organized around defending against her castration, and both of which therefore presuppose a male or masculine gazer, a sadistic, voyeuristic look, whereby the gazer salves his unpleasure at female lack by seeing the woman punished, and a fetishistic scopophilic look, whereby the gazer salves his unpleasure by fetishizing the female body in whole or part. Needless to say, horror movies spend a lot of time looking at women, and in first-person ways that do indeed seem well described by Mulvey's sadistic, voyeuristic gaze. But the story does not end there. A standard horror format calls for a variety of positions and character sympathies in the early phases of the story, but as the plot goes on, a consolidation at both levels, story and cinematography, and in the final phase a fairly tight organization around the functions of victim and hero, which may be collapsed into one figure or alternatively split into many. Although the camera work of Carrie repeatedly invites us to take the perspective of Carrie's sadistic tormentors, a familiar feature of Brian De Palma's direction, the majority position throughout, and certainly the position that prevails in the final phase, is Carrie's own. It seems clear on the face of it that involvement in her revenge at the end is contingent on an earlier involvement with her pain. I shall be arguing throughout this book that by any measure, horror is far more victim-identified than the standard view would have it, which raises questions about film theory's conventional assumption that the cinematic apparatus...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?